All right, so we are going to proceed with opening statements. Mr. Voorhees, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. And thank you for being our jury. On behalf of my client and myself, I want to thank you for being here this morning. I also want to assure you this process can seem sort of tedious at times, but this is a very quick trial in the eyes of the law. We should be finished with our evidence on the plaintiff side at the end of the day, possibly on the defense side by tomorrow. And in the legal world, a 2.5 or 1.5 day trial is the blink of an eye. But in the grand scheme, what you have to look at is that this case goes back 4 years, and the damages that we're going to be talking about are potentially for a very long time in the future. So just keep that in mind, please, while you're listening to the evidence. Now, this is the case of Holly Harmon versus Chad Janes. And as Judge Dahlin told you, there's only one question that you're going to answer at the end of this case. And the question is, what's the reasonable value of non-economic damages to Holly's life because Mr. Janes ran a red light? And when the evidence is stacked up at the end of this case, reasonable damages you'll see are $250,000. Because what you have to remember is that your verdict is for all time. Holly does not get a second chance to have another jury trial and come back and check in with you in 10, 15, 20 years when she's at a later stage in her life, because this is her only trial. Now, the car crash we're here to talk about happened 4 years ago on April 5th, 2017. And if we were to go back in time to around 11 o'clock that morning, here's what we would see. We'd see Chad Janes, the defendant in this case, and he's driving a Hertz rental car. Now, Mr. Janes flew in from California a few days before, and on April 5th, he's driving on his way back to the airport to fly back to California in the rental car, but he doesn't make it. According to 2 eyewitnesses, he's speeding over 50 miles an hour, and he runs not one, but at least 2 red lights when he smashes into Holly's minivan. And the crash happens, just to give you a perspective of where we're at in Portland, happens near the Clackamas Town Center at the intersection of Sunnyside Road and Southeast 93rd. Now here's an aerial of the intersection, and you can see Mr. Janes is traveling eastbound on Sunnyside, while Holly's going north on 93rd through a green light, attempting to make a left turn to go westbound onto 93rd. Now here's sort of a perspective of how the crash occurred, and Mr. Janes' perspective as he's traveling eastbound on Sunnyside through the intersection of 93rd. Now here's some photos of the damage to the vehicles at the time of the crash. And just to give you another perspective of how the crash occurred, you can see that the front left side of Mr. Janes' vehicle smashed into the rear driver's side of Holly's minivan as she was going through the green light. So, how do we know that the crash happened this way? Well, we took the depositions of the 2 eyewitnesses. Now, the first eyewitness is Jeanette Lamb, and she was at a stoplight previous to the one where the collision happened, and she was making a left turn and was about 7 car lengths behind Mr. Janes, so she saw the whole thing happen. And in the vehicle with her was her daughter, Danielle Bass. And we took both of their depositions, and a deposition essentially is where a witness is sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, just like they would if they were at trial. So a video deposition is no different than trial testimony. And here's a little bit about what they had to say. Actually see the collision?
Yes.
Did you see Mr. Janes' traffic light in his direction?
Yes.
What color was it?
Red.
Is there any doubt in your mind?
No.
And
Not yellow, red.
do you remember what the speed limit is on Sunnyside Road in that area?
I'm not sure. It might 35 or 40. I'm not sure, but he was going much faster than that.
How fast do you think he was going?
I don't know, but I would assume over 50.
So obviously the audio is a little off with the video, but you'll see the full video deposition during the course of this trial. And here's a little bit about what Jeanette's daughter, Danielle, had to say about what she saw.
Your Honor, if I might remind Mr. Voorhees of UTCR 3.030 and the manner of address of witnesses in a case should be by their last names and not their first names.
All right, so Mr. Voorhees, if you could refer to the witnesses by their last name. So an example in this case, Ms. Bass.
No problem, Your Honor. Thank you.
And then referring to Ms. Harmon, you can refer to her as Ms. Harmon or Ms. Richards. As I've already told the jury and during jury selection, the case was filed as Holly Harmon as the plaintiff, but she subsequently, after filing the lawsuit, married, so she has a different name. But however you want to refer to her is fine, but please use the last names.
Thank you, Your Honor. And again, for Ms. Harmon's case, I've known her as Ms. Harmon, and recently she was married to Derek Richards, who will be here to testify. So if there's some mix up with that, then that's the clarification. So Ms. Bass testified, and here's a little bit about what Ms. Bass had to say. Can you just tell the jury what you saw that day?
Yeah, so my mom and I were waiting at a light and there was a car in front of us and the light turned green and my mom said, "Oh my gosh, that guy just ran the red light." And I looked up and I saw the guy bombing through the intersection while we had a green light and he was going like really, like he was running his light. And he was just like going super, super fast, and yeah, that's what I saw.
So this is a case where Mr. Janes has admitted 100% fault for causing a collision. This was no accident. Mr. Janes made a deliberate decision to drive in excess of the speed limit and run a red light at that intersection. It's not an accident, and that's the reason why we're here. And he's responsible for 100% of the damages that he caused. So that brings us to our question: what's the reasonable value of non-economic damages to Ms. Harmon's life? And the question is, how do you assess damages in a case like this? Now, how does a jury assess damages? Well, in order to do that, you need to know about who this human being was before the crash and how her life has been affected since. And the human being is Ms. Richards. Now, she was born in Layton, Utah, December 20th, 1979. She's now 41 years old. Now, Layton, Utah is a small town north of Salt Lake City, and she grew up in a family with a few brothers and a few sisters, and she was raised in the Mormon church. And when she was just a few years old, her parents bought her a little Casio keyboard, and she absolutely loved it. According to her mom, she started playing real music on that keyboard when she was still a toddler. And within a few years in elementary school, her love for the piano developed into a love for theater, and specifically musical theater. So she started writing songs and musicals when she was in middle school. And as you can see in the top right corner, she was able to convince her group of friends when they were still small to take on acting roles in her musicals. And that's what we're looking at here. And they would put on shows for family and neighbors. And in the 9th grade, she actually produced and directed a musical for the entire school in the school auditorium. Now, she went to Layton High School, and while she was there, her passion for music and theater continued. And that's where she met her lifelong friend, Maren Swenson, who you'll hear from in this trial later today. They've been friends for over 25 years. Now, she went on to study theater at Rick's College. And throughout this time, her dream was always to be in musical theater, to be a playwright, to write music, and to play music. But like many of us, she was torn between the expectations of others, like her family, and pursuing her passion, which is her dream of musical theater. Now, as I mentioned before, she had an upbringing in the Mormon church. She was expected by her family and her community to get married, have kids, and be a mother and wife. And that's what she did. At 20 years old, she got married and became a mother almost immediately. And eventually she had 4 kids, all of whom she loves dearly. But during that time, she put her dream on the shelf. And after about a decade or so, in 2012, when she was about 32 years old, she and her young family moved to Oregon. And around that time, her marriage began to unravel, started to fall apart, and eventually got a divorce. But for Miss Richards, it was a time to start a new chapter in her life that began to unfold. And in her mid-30s, as a single mother of four, who'd been a homemaker for over a decade, it was time to take her dreams off the shelf. And she wasn't going to put her passion of being a musician and a playwright on the back burner anymore. She was going to get involved in the theater scene that she loved so much. So she started writing full-fledged musicals in her mid-30s. And she'll tell you it can take years just to write a single musical, considering not only the entire script, but the music is all originally written and produced by the playwright. And that's exactly what she did. Her first major production was a one-woman play that she wrote, directed, and produced called Pop Goes the Bubble. And it's about a young Mormon girl whose mind was opened up by taking a trip to New York and seeing a Broadway show. And it premiered over 2 weekends at the Great Salt Lake Fringe Festival, and it was a big hit. Now, on top of that, she was taking care of her 4 kids as a single mom, and in what little spare time she had, she went back to school, back to college at Marylhurst University, and she studied music theory, story theory, and playwriting. And she's written many more musicals since that time. And she spends almost all of her free times, if not with her children, writing, rehearsing, and producing musicals. And one of her recent musicals is called Welcome to Zion. And just to give you an idea of what Holly's passion is and what she spends most of her free time doing, I'm going to play for you a short clip from the beginning of the musical, and you can see Holly over here on the left side playing the piano. So when Holly's not in rehearsals, taking care of her kids, she's spending her time at her workstation at home. And this is a picture of her workstation where she writes and records music, and she'll be able to explain to you everything that entails. But that's a little bit about Holly's, Ms. Harmon's, or Ms. Richards' life, personal life up to now. And professionally, she has her dream job. She works full-time as the development manager for the Broadway Rose Theater Company, and she absolutely loves her job there. But outside of family, what she loves most is writing music and musical theaters. So again, she was recently married to Derek Richards in the summer of 2019. And as I mentioned before, Holly has 4 kids from her first marriage, but Derek Richards has 4 kids from his previous marriage as well. So now they just have one Brady Bunch-like family, and this is where she spends most of her time. So here's a photo of Holly with her kids and Derek's kids. Now, you'll hear from Derek, and you'll hear from Maren Swenson, and obviously you'll hear from Holly. And what you'll hear is, despite what's happened in the crash, they're living their lives to the fullest. And Holly's a very positive person. Now, if that's all you heard about what she was going through looking from the outside, you might think, well, why are we here? I mean, her life looks great. She looks like someone who's living her passions and everything's fine. But oftentimes we don't see someone's internal struggles or their health struggles just by looking at them from the outside, because everyone's fighting their own battles, whether we can see it or not. And despite the injuries I'm about to tell you about, it's very obvious that Holly's resilient and trying her best to stay positive. So that brings us to where we are now. And talking about the damages in this case, we have to go through some medical terminology. And I don't want you to be overwhelmed by any of this because it's extremely simple. And to understand the injuries in this case that were caused by Mr. Janes, there are 2 types of injuries in this case. There's injury to the nervous system, which we call neurological injury, and there's injury to the musculoskeletal system, which is typically called a sprain strain. Now, the reason why we know this is because when there's injury to the nervous system, a patient will present with symptoms of numbness, tingling sensations, pins and needles sensations, or lost sensation. And if there's neurological injury in the upper extremities, your arms, then that will result in problems with your fingers, numbness, tingling, pins and needles, lost sensation. And when somebody has musculoskeletal injury, they present with symptoms of pain in the soft tissue of their musculoskeletal system, particularly their neck in a car crash. And that can result in pain, aches, soreness, lost range of motion, and tightness. So Ms. Richards is dealing with chronic pain from musculoskeletal injury in her neck, but she's also dealing with neurological injury that's resulting in symptoms of numbness, tingling, pins and needles, and lost sensations in both of her arms, all the way down to her fingertips, but more so in the left arm. So those are the two injuries we're going to be talking about. And one of the doctors that's going to be here to testify is Dr. David Russo, and he'll be able to go through all of this. So don't be intimidated by the medical terminology. So how do we know that these things are going on with Miss Richards? Well, number one, you're going to hear it from her directly that all of these symptoms started at the date of the crash and have continued for the last 4 years. And we also know it because Dr. Brian Lindeman is Ms. Richards' family doctor, and she went to see Dr. Lindeman within 48 hours of the crash. And here's what she reported to Dr. Lindeman when she saw him. She was noting some tingling in both hands with numbness. So again, that's an indication that somebody has neurological injury. Now, the nervous system is really quite simple. There's only two parts to the nervous system. There's the central nervous system, which is composed of our brain and our spinal cord. But there's also the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all of the nerves that are going out from our spinal cord into every extremity in our body. And it's kind of like long strings of spaghetti shooting out from our spinal cord into all these different extremities in our body. And what you have to remember about injury to the nervous system that you'll hear from Dr. Russo is that nerves, those fibers, they don't like to be touched. And the medical term for that is compression. So if there's compression on one of those nerve fibers, those spaghetti strings, at any point along the way, that can result in symptoms of numbness, tingling, pins and needles, and lost sensation. So Dr. Russo will tell you that there is some compression in Holly's neurological system on the peripheral nerves, and that's what's resulting in those symptoms. He'll also tell you that she has injury to her musculoskeletal system in terms of chronic pain, which is any pain that lasts beyond 6 months, because she's still experiencing pain in the soft tissues of her neck. She's still experiencing tightness and achiness and some issues with limited range of motion. So what did Dr. Lindeman do? Well, he referred Holly to Ms. Richards to Providence Physical Therapy, Providence, Willamette Falls. And Ms. Richards went there because she, at the time, had been there in the past, which we'll get to in a moment. But at physical therapy, she again, on the very first visit, reported that she had interim pain down her left UE, which is her upper extremity, so her left arm to her elbow, with constant numbness in her hands. Her hands were cold, and her main issue was her neck. So those are her reported symptoms. Well, she went back to physical therapy one more time, and that was it. She didn't go to physical therapy anymore because there was a PT student teaching her. So she decided that she wasn't getting the level of care that she needed. As you can see, she was being treated by Nicole Brune Cotton, who is a physical therapy student. And because of that, Holly decided that she was going to try something different. So what she did was she went to a chiropractor named Dr. Scott Boles. And she'd never been to Dr. Boles before, and she decided to try him out because he was near her home at the time. And you'll hear from Dr. Boles by video deposition, and I'm going to apologize in advance because it's a slightly over an hour and it's slightly tedious to get through his deposition, but he'll be testifying by video deposition. And here's what Dr. Boles is going to say. Dr. Boles is also going to say that Holly had symptoms of numbness, tingling, pins and needles, and lost sensation in her upper extremities. He's also going to tell us that she continued to have pain, aches, lost range of motion, tightness in her cervical spine as well. And he treated her for the next several years. So Ms. Richards treated with Dr. Boles all the way through 2019. Now, Dr. Boles is a chiropractor, and he's not a physiatrist, he's not a neurosurgeon, but what he suspected at the time was that Ms. Richards had something called cervical radiculopathy. Now, that's just a fancy medical term for nerve compression at a nerve root in the cervical spine, which is your neck, when there's a disc herniation. So this is a model of basically the spine. So what we have here is two vertebrae, and then we have an intervertebral disc, is this red portion right here. And then we have our spinal cord that runs through the canal, the spinal canal. And then we have nerve roots on each side of the spinal cord, and those nerve roots are where those long spaghetti strings will shoot down your shoulder all the way down into your fingertips. So the vertebral body is this part right here, and then we have our spinous process, the transverse process, and that's just a little short anatomy lesson. But well, what is cervical radiculopathy? That's what happens when someone's in a car crash and there's a quick flexion or extension of their spine and it's jolted. A disc will can herniate, and that's a herniated disc. And as you can see, it's touching that nerve root, and that's what's called compression. So when that happens, that's what results in these symptoms of numbness, tingling, pins and needles, and lost sensation. And the only way you can confirm whether there's a disc herniation is either if a neurosurgeon cuts you open and actually visualizes the herniation, or they do an MRI, which has not been done yet. So that's a diagnostic test that Ms. Richards needs to find out if that's the case. So Ms. Richards treated with Dr. Boles for several years until she decided to go back to Dr. Lindeman and see if there's anything that could be done about it. So she saw Dr. Lindeman on January 24th of last year, just before the pandemic. And here's what she reported at that time. She reported that she had bilateral, which means both sides, numbness in her hands since MVA, motor vehicle accident, 3 years ago. So what we decided to do is send her out for a second opinion to a doctor named Dr. David Russo, and he'll be here to testify. And Dr. David Russo performed a physical examination of Ms. Richards on June 30th, 2020, last year. Now, what Dr. Russo is going to explain is that Ms. Richards does, in fact, have musculoskeletal injury. She has sprain strain injury to the muscles and soft tissues in her neck, and that has resulted in chronic pain. And he'll tell you that there are treatment options for her. There's ways to control pain, there's ways to deal with pain, but Ms. Richards originally went to a chiropractor because she wanted to treat naturally. She didn't want to take medications, she didn't want to do surgery, she wanted to see if everything would just go away on its own with some treatment with Dr. Boles. Well, unfortunately, it has not. So Dr. Russo will be able to talk to us about some treatment options. He'll also testify that Ms. Richards does in fact have neurological injury, and that it's probable that it's one of these three injuries: cervical radiculopathy, which we already discussed, or something called thoracic outlet syndrome. And what thoracic outlet syndrome is, well, we have the nerve roots coming out of our spinal cord, and they run all the way down into our fingertips, but they've got to go through some tunnels in order to get to our extremities. And one of the first tunnels it has to go through is called the thoracic outlet. And the thoracic outlet is the area where this bundle of nerves called the brachial plexus go above the first rib and below the clavicle. So that's called the thoracic outlet right there. And there can be compression that can cause these very same symptoms. There's another tunnel that one nerve has to go through called the ulnar nerve. And that's the nerve that's essentially connected to the ulna, one of the two bones in your forearm. It's called the cubital tunnel. And when someone has compression in the cubital tunnel, that can result in something called ulnar neuropathy. Now, neuropathy is just the medical term for nerve compression. So diagnostic testing needs to be done in order to find out which one of these three or more is causing the symptoms that Ms. Richards is experiencing to this day. So again, cervical radiculopathy is just a herniated disc. Thoracic outlet syndrome is potentially the exact same as brachial plexus injury or ulnar neuropathy. So what tests can be done to find out what's going on with these symptoms and what can be done about it? Dr. Russo will tell us that an MRI is the common method of confirming or denying whether it's cervical radiculopathy, whether there's a disc herniation, because you can actually see the soft tissues, such as the disc in between our vertebrae. You can actually visualize it on an MRI. He's also going to testify that electrodiagnostic studies can be done to either confirm or rule out thoracic outlet syndrome or ulnar neuropathy. Now, a nerve conduction study can only do that. It can only look for ulnar neuropathy or thoracic outlet syndrome, and EMGs are commonly used to confirm or rule out disc herniations. So that brings us to the only question of what are the damages in this case? And in this case, they're non-economic. Like I talked to you about in jury selection. You're going to decide on a fair and reasonable dollar figure for pain, suffering, fear, stress, inconvenience, lost enjoyment of life. And you'll hear testimony about pain, but as I'm sure we're all aware that the psychological aspect of pain, the mental suffering is usually much worse than the pain. It's the thoughts associated with pain. Like, when will this end? Am I going to get better? What's going to happen if it doesn't? What's going to happen in 10 or 20 years? That's mental suffering. Will I still be able to play the piano in 10 years? And you're going to hear about the fear and the stress of someone whose passion is playing music and playing the piano, and what it would be like, the absolute fear of starting to lose sensation in your fingertips as a musician because of neurological injury. You're also going to hear about the inconvenience of having to see doctors over the last 4 years with 8 kids to take care of, with a full-time job at Broadway Rose, with trying to pursue your passion as a playwright, having to take time out of your day to drive across town and sit in a waiting room 70 or 80 times, as she had to do with Dr. Boles. So we're not going to have her testify about any of these things for sympathy. No one wants you to feel bad for her. She has her family and her friends that can do that for her if she wants. You're here to simply listen to this sort of evidence so that you can evaluate what the damages are in this case. And the non-economic damages, you'll get an instruction that says that there's no fixed standard to measure the exact amount of non-economic damages, but the law requires that all your damages be reasonable. And you must apply your own considered judgment to determine the amount of non-economic damages. All that means is using your common sense. Applying your own considered judgment is using your own life experiences to deliberate on what these things are worth. And at the end, as Judge Dahlin explained to you, the burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence. What's more likely true and not true? Now, before we came to trial, we obviously had to look into Ms. Richards' medical history to see if these claims could be brought and if there are any issues that we needed to discuss to clarify before we came to trial. And what we found was that Ms. Richards told us and has always been open about the fact that she's been involved in 2 prior car crashes before the crash with Mr. Janes. She was in a crash on June 16th of 2015. And then she went to Providence Willamette Falls physical therapy 7 times. And she went there because she had a friend that worked there as a pharmacist, and she decided to go to see if she could get treatment for neck pain. So she did that 7 times, and we obtained those medical records, and we found that as of the last visit, the 7th visit in August of 2015, she had no more complaints of neck pain. Her cervical range of motion was completely within normal limits. So at that time, her issues had completely resolved. There's no question about it. And that crash was not her fault. She was rear-ended. She testified to that in her deposition that was taken by Mr. Barger and his law partner, Stacy Darling. So there's no question about that. She was in another crash in November of that year when she was again rear-ended at a stoplight where she was not at fault. And that happened on November 25th of 2015. And after that crash, Ms. Richards only went to physical therapy 4 times. And after that, she said on her 4th visit, "I'm feeling great. I was a little sore after my last session. Yesterday had no problems despite it being an active day. Ms. Richards feels comfortable with this being the last session and coming back if need be." And that's the important part, if need be, because she never went back. She only, well, let me back it up a bit. So on the last visit, this was the note that's important that says, right here, recreation, I'm able to engage in all my recreational activities with no neck pain at all. So we have confirmation from a medical record on January 24th, 2016, that she was completely finished with treatment and needed nothing else after that time. Now, if you have to ask yourself, if Holly had serious ongoing injury, well, why would she not go back? And another thing that's important is she never filed a lawsuit for these claims, and they were not her fault. She filed a lawsuit against Mr. Janes because her injuries were caused by this crash and have persisted for the last 4 years. Now this is a comparison between the crash with Mr. Janes and the treatment that Ms. Harmon had as of 2016. So a year and 4 months go by before the crash with Mr. Janes, and she has absolutely no medical treatment. Her medical treatment began in this case within 48 hours of the April 5th, 2017 crash. And just to give you a perspective of all the treatment that she's had since then, all of these red crosses indicate the treatment that she's had with Dr. Linneman, physical therapy, and Dr. Boles. Now, she's been to Dr. Linneman only 3 times. And what's important about Dr. Linneman is he's a family doctor. He's not a physiatrist. He's not a specialist. She only saw him 3 times, so we're not going to bring him in here to testify because he's only treated her 3 times. And she went to the physical therapist twice and stopped going because they were treating her with a PT student. So we're bringing you the most important witnesses in this case, which are Dr. Boles, who treated her for the majority of 2017 and 18, and then Dr. Russo, who we sent her to for a second opinion in June of last year. Now, Holly, there's a significant period where she didn't get any treatment after September of 2018 up until she saw Dr. Lindemann again in January 2020. And the reason why is because Ms. Richards will tell you that she needed a break from treatment. She was feeling overwhelmed with the treatment, working, writing plays, taking care of her children. She decided, you know what, I'm just going to see if I can cope with this and deal with this and see what happens. And unfortunately, it just still has not gone away. So again, that brings us back to the burden of proof of what's more likely true and not true. And what you'll hear from the defense side is they're going to bring in 2 witnesses. And the witnesses are Dr. Mangum and Dr. Leonard. Now, the thing about Dr. Leonard and Dr. Mangum is that the defense case relies entirely on these 2 witnesses. And nobody in this courtroom has ever met these 2 witnesses other than Mr. Barger. These witnesses have never examined Holly. They've never met her. They don't know what she looks like. They've just reviewed documents that were provided to them by Mr. Barger. So it's important to recognize that for a physician, taking a physical exam and a medical history directly from a patient is extremely important. And that's what you're going to hear during this case as to why that is from Dr. Russo. And what you hear is that these 2 witnesses who have never met Holly, Ms. Richards, who don't know Ms. Richards, are going to testify that they know more about what's going on with Ms. Richards than she does, than Dr. Boles, than Dr. Russo, than her husband, and her friend Maren Swenson, all of whom have known Holly for a very long period of time, with the exception of Dr. Russo. So at the end of the case, it's going to be your job to decide what's more likely true than not true. All the evidence that Holly has to support her claims that she's been significantly injured, has had neurological injury, chronic neck pain for the last 4 years into the foreseeable future, or the evidence that's going to be brought to you by the defense, which are 2 witnesses who have never met anybody except for Mr. Barger in this case. So again, we appreciate your time, and we believe that the evidence is going to support a verdict in our favor, and that in this case, what's more likely right than wrong is Ms. Richards' story. Thank you.